Good evening, everyone, and good morning to our friends in Australia. Welcome to this special event on Australia's and the U.S. approaches to cyber and critical technologies. My name's Martijn Rasser. I'm a senior fellow in the Technology National Security Program here at the Center for New American Security. How governments deal with matters of technology is an integral component of foreign policy, diplomacy, economic security, and national security. We're starting to see countries shift toward crafting national strategic approaches to technology policy. Australia and the United States are very much at the forefront of this trend. That's why we brought together a fantastic panel to talk about this. So it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Dr. Tobias Feakin is Australia's inaugural Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. Tarun Chhabra, Senior Director for Technology and National Security on the National Security Council staff, and Lauren Zabierek, Executive Director of the Cyber Project at Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. So I've asked Toby, Tarun, and Lauren to each provide a few minutes of opening remarks to share their perspectives and to set the stage for us. And from there, we'll open it up to discussion. Now, this is very much an interactive event, so we want to hear from you in the audience. And there's a couple ways you can do this. One is by using the text field on CNAS.org live to submit a question, or you can tweet your question to us using the hashtag CNAS 2021. That's hashtag CNAS 2021. So Toby, let's start with you. Australia recently presented its International Cyber and Critical Tech Engagement Strategy. Tell us about what's in it and what the goals are.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Look, Martin, and firstly, thank you very much for hosting all of us today. And for CNAS's work in this area, it's really quite impressive the way that you guys have, if you like, caught the policy zeitgeist in the way that you're looking at these issues. Look, I think, you know, the strategy that we've just released in many ways reflects what we're seeing go on in the world. And certainly in the time that I've been in this position, you've seen this fundamental shift in the way that tech issues writ large have become an absolute central feature of geopolitics. You know, we've seen a very clear shift in the political and economic conditions and strategic alignment around technology. And that's one of a huge amount of not only complexity, but competition. And as that plays out, that competition plays out in cyberspace and through the development of the application of technology, you know, we felt that it was important that Australia had an international position that it could bring forward out into the world, because, you know, we need to be on the front foot on these issues now in this international context in which we find ourselves. And, you know, we can probably go into detail about, you know, some of the ways in which technology is being misused by many countries. I mean, many of those examples are just quite clear for us all to see. But I think also something that gets lost sometimes in that discussion is the fact that the kind of technological innovations that we're seeing, which are all happening at a similar rate of knots, and especially in the digital domain, whether it be AI, quantum computing, blockchain, et cetera, the list goes on, you've heard it many times, they're maturing at a similar rate of knots. And there is no escaping the fact that the countries that are at the forefront of these new technological developments will essentially be at the forefront of the 21st century economy and power dynamics that then play out. So, you know, there's so many good things that these technologies are going to do for our societies, you know, whether it be in healthcare, whether it be in online commerce, entirely new industries that are creating around these technologies. But, you know, we do need to be able to address a lot of the underlying ways in which some of these technologies are being misused. And I know we'll get onto this discussion, but you know, it's the fact that if we don't internationally engage, we can be prepared to be shaped by those technologies in ways which don't align with our values. And something that we felt very strongly about through the strategy that we released is that this is a values-based approach to technology. And so we've stated those core values that make us Australian, whether they be liberal democratic values, adherence to human rights, international law, ethical principles, gender and diversity issues being at the heart of the way in which we engage on technology. We felt that was important to state as a starting point. And really, what does it provide? It provides any of our policymakers in the Australian government with the ability to go out and engage on tech issues, even if you do not understand, the minutiae of how quantum computer works and how it operates. You can still go and engage on those issues and pursue Australian interests in that technological world, which is really important because we all need to now be talking tech, cyber, whatever it might be, because it is such a core part of government policy. So the strategy looks at values. It lays out what it is we want from a national security perspective. How do we ensure that we're engaging in the right bodies in terms of legal and normative discussions on this range of technologies that exist, and try and still further squeeze the operating space of those who are trying to exploit these technologies for negative ends. But then also, what do we want to promote? How do we ensure access to market technologies? And something that COVID has taught us is that you do very quickly get squeeze points and shocks on your supply chain. And for a net technology importer like Australia, it's important that we retain that access and diversify as far as we can. So there's a big piece in the strategy for those who want to have a delve. It's quite a lengthy document, but I think that represents, if you like, the state of play of where we are, of laying the scene for what Australia wants. So it's really based around those three principles, but it's a statement of intent. It's showing that we're committed to the international environment. We're committed to new ways of doing business because, we can't always rely on the traditional means and avenues of multilateralism. We will and will always engage in peak bodies. But I think some of the work that you're seeing coming out of the Quad, which I've been working on with Tarun and, CNAS and yourself, Martin, have been doing a lot of work in building some meat on the bones of what that looks like. But I think that's an embodiment of the way that you'll see increasingly nations like ours operate. How do we begin to shape that technology environment to ensure that it ends up as a net positive for our societies throughout the 21st century?
Great. Thank you so much, Toby. So, Tarun, it's still relatively early days for the Biden administration, yet there's been a lot of activity in the realm of tech policy. Can you walk us through some of the key developments that have taken place and how the administration is thinking about tech policy differently than, I would say, most other administrations that have preceded it?
Thanks very much, Martin. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and Toby and Lauren. And Toby's been such a fantastic partner in the Quad Technology Working Group, and obviously in a bilateral context, we've worked together as well. And in so many ways, I think the work that we're doing in the administration builds on a lot of the creative and kind of foresight of you and your colleagues at CNAS. So it's really a pleasure to be here. So, I think in an outward-facing way, a lot of what you have seen has been through our diplomatic engagement, right? You've seen the establishment of a Quad Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group. You're going to hear a lot more from us in the coming months and across the administration. There, you've seen the visit of Japanese Prime Minister Suga, Korean President Moon, as well. And in each of those visits, technology has been prominent on the agenda. That's because it's a priority for us and it's a priority for our partners as well. And so what I thought I'd do, since that's kind of out there, is just to say a few words just about how we are thinking about some pillars of our kind of broader approach while we continue to kind of develop a more public-facing strategy. But I think the outline, I think we can definitely share now. And the first part of that, which President Biden has been speaking about, very publicly in his joint session to Congress, and at the unveiling of the a full-size electric truck when he was in Michigan, is investing at home, right? So investing in research and development, right? So the American Jobs Plan, proposes the biggest increase in non-defense research and development, on record, and that's because, as the president said, we're going to see more technological change in the next decade or so than we have potentially in the last 2050, and there's a risk that without these investments, we will fall behind in that competition in ways that would be fundamentally adverse to our national security, our prosperity, and our values. And the president's also been clear that he thinks we ought to be moving toward the historical high of spending on R&D as a proportion of GDP, which has been about 2%, as you know, whereas we have hit almost an all-time low in the post-war period at a time when geopolitical competition is back, so that is not going to happen overnight. As you all know, there are active discussions on the Hill about this, but the president's been pretty clear on that front. Another piece of that is obviously on advanced manufacturing, and so that and we think that's critical. It goes hand in hand with the R&D agenda. The piece of this that I know you and many others have been following very closely is obviously on semiconductors. We're very excited about the prospect of getting very significant bipartisan support for semiconductor manufacturing incentives, as well as a major semiconductor research and development program that would ensure the United States is really the leading edge in both of these fields, but also brings in our allies and partners so that we really have a flourishing allied semiconductor ecosystem. And we focus so much on semiconductors because, as you know, they are the building blocks, right, of a modern economy, and will drive so much innovation across technology sectors. I won't get into it, but obviously telecommunications is another important piece of this. But let me go on to workforce. So I think we often we're very good at rattling off technologies, right? That's our job in many respects. But so much of this comes down to people and talent, right? And our ability to maintain leadership really relies on that. And historically, our great superpower, I think, in the United States has been our ability to attract the world's best and brightest to the United States, to ensure that they can work with, collaborate with researchers around the world, especially in allied and partner countries. And this is an area where we have to, I think, put a lot more focus. And again, this is a long-term project. If you look, at the bachelor's, master's, PhD level STEM degrees in the United States, I think the increases have been far too modest for the global competition that we faced. And they're not meeting the available jobs, right, in our economy either. Some of you have probably seen the same projections, but that China could be producing almost twice as many STEM PhD graduates by 2025 at the current pace. And we're already beginning to see those kinds of numbers at the master's level. So this really means we need a really robust agenda when it comes to education, and we can't ignore the piece on STEM immigration. Third is on just our what I would call our science and technology horizon scanning and intelligence more broadly, much of which can be done open source, and you all have done good work on this as well. But it's a number of things here. It's how do we bring the best STEM expertise that already exists inside our government? How do we bring it to bear to address the whole range of policy challenges and tools that are available to us, both on the protection side, but also to inform our R&D agenda, so on and so forth. We are blessed with tremendous expertise from our national labs to the intelligence community to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Commerce Department, but we have to ensure that we're leveraging that expertise in discrete sectors to inform, again, the full range of policy tools that we have. I think we also have to ensure that those colleagues inside our government are empowered to talk to folks with deep expertise outside the government, right? Whether that is in companies, whether those are investors or colleagues in academia, because often that technical expertise outside in the business intelligence is just invaluable in informing our policy. And then there's making sure that we are bringing in the workforce that we need, right? And I think that's another area that we're focused on. Fourth is just protecting critical and emerging technology. I think this is an area that's certainly got a lot of attention lately. It generates a lot of news, and we are looking across the full spectrum of tools, from export controls to investment screening to research security, to ensure that all of these tools are being brought to bear together in a way that makes sense, that is consonant with our overall policy objectives. Also, to ensure that we're identifying gaps, which I think increasingly we are seeing folks looking to circumvent in ways that are quite sophisticated. I think a distinct but related matter is of course, protecting sensitive data, which we want to protect for its own sake, but also because it can be used to fuel progress in advanced technologies, from AI to genomics, in ways that could run very contrary to our values and other interests. And then I think we have to ensure that these tools, as we deploy them, as we develop frameworks for doing so, that we're doing it in partnership with our allies, to ensure that where we can, the sphere of protection, the sphere of the free flow of data is as large as possible for trusted actors with other countries. So that's obviously a huge focus of ours as well. Another area that I won't get into too deeply, but just is technology standards, which is an area I know that you've worked on, and certainly Toby and I have talked a lot about in the Quad context, and is an area of focus for the Quad Technology Working Group. Again, it is values driven, and it's focused on maintaining the integrity of standards bodies and maintaining the multi-stakeholder approach that's delivered so much technological progress, and guarding against efforts to manipulate or undermine the integrity of some of these bodies. And then finally, just on allied engagement, I've already talked about it in the context of some of these key priorities. Toby and I are working together in the Quad. I mentioned the Korea and the Japan visits at the head of state level. I think I'll just say there's also been lots of allied engagement on these issues that isn't public and won't necessarily be public, but it's well underway right now. And looking forward, I think expect technology issues to be high on the agenda for the president's engagement with European leaders, and also for engagement with the European Union as well. So I'll leave it there for now, but really appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Absolutely, Tarun. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview. So Lauren, you've heard Toby and Tarun talk about their respective governments' efforts. Now you bring to bear a wide range of expertise and have your own unique perspective on these issues. So what's your take on these developments? How are you viewing these new initiatives?
Yeah, thanks, Martijn. And I just want to say, thanks for having me here. Thanks to the whole CNAS staff. In a word, I totally agree with Ambassador Feakin and Tarun. I'll kind of go into some of my thoughts here. So I run the cyber project at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center. My driving vision behind the project has been cybersecurity is national security. And I suppose we should add to that, critical technologies too. But we have to understand that national security simply cannot solely be the federal government's responsibility. It is incumbent upon all of us to protect our nation from threats emanating from cyberspace and from these critical technologies. I'm really encouraged to think that we've entered a period in which the White House and many in Congress truly understand these threats and are actively working on strategies to address them from a whole of government and a whole of nation perspective. Take, for instance, the cybersecurity or the Cyber Solarium Commission's groundbreaking report released last year. It laid out a number of provisions and strategic objectives that would shore up our resilience in cybersecurity, both in the government and the private sector. Many of these recommendations actually have ended up into legislation. So they're put into the FY 2021 NDAA. And then the commission actually continues to push some of these recommendations, for future legislation. But among those, very importantly, has been the National Cyber Director role, which former deputy director of the NSA, Chris Inglis, has been nominated to fill. And on the critical technology side, the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence released its final report this year, which again outlines a number of recommendations that people, including myself, are very excited about. And these recommendations will ensure that the United States retains its edge in this domain. But also, as both of the guests just mentioned, they're driven by democratic values in their research, the development, and the application of AI. And of particular note, the recommendations for increased collaboration on AI with our allies and our like-minded partners are really important because, that will also necessitate increased investment in our relationships. The Commission recognizes that we can't counter authoritarian nations in their development and use of AI alone. We have to work together with our allies to ensure that AI is used in accordance with our values and to counter that authoritarian use. So it was actually in this spirit that I advocated for U.S. tech diplomacy last year, similar to what Australia is doing, writing that we advocate for a full tech diplomacy strategy that focuses on collaboration, on research and development, ethics, and standards of emerging technologies, and engagement on the use of current technology. Doing so will bolster our ability to harness our precious human and material resources and signal to the world that we are committed to the development and use of technologies consistent with our values. The commissions and their respective reports have been vital in helping to lay the foundation for forthcoming U.S. national strategy on cybersecurity and critical technologies. But more work has to be done on both issues. The Biden administration has issued interim guidance, which makes cybersecurity an imperative across the government, while also working with the private sector to manage and share risk and to increase investments in infrastructure and people, which I'm so heartened to know that includes diversity. And it also seeks to renew multilateral engagement on cyber and tech issues. And as we're witnessing right now, this is so vital during this time where we continue to be hit with crippling attacks, much like the ransomware attack a few weeks ago on the Colonial Pipeline. Much like the previous attacks this year, the pipeline attack, unlike the attacks this year, the pipeline attack was felt acutely by regular, everyday people. But it, much like those attacks, is served to highlight where we need future attention on these issues, such as critical infrastructure, private-public collaboration, and enhanced information sharing. I recently wrote that we should have a regulatory body to help develop frameworks for safety and security that can evolve with these changing threats and certify and enforce standards for, at the very least, what we identify as systemically important critical infrastructure. And that President Biden must include cybersecurity requirements in the infrastructure bill. And I saw today that DHS is actually now starting to have requirements for pipeline operators in cybersecurity, which is great. We've also been working on a paper that addresses collaborative defense and threat intelligence sharing between the public and private sectors. So we're excited to get that out at some point this summer. And then the administration just released a new executive order that sets the bar high for service providers seeking to do business with the federal government, with the expectation that the rest of the industry will follow suit. And I think, by mandating that service providers raise their level of security, they improve their data collection and sharing, and, that removes contractual barriers to sharing across the government, I know that there is going to be, some really positive effects, second order effects, across government and across the industry. On the tech side, the Commission's work on AI is a very important start, but we can't just limit our investment and attention there. And obviously we heard from Tarun, and I think, there's a great deal of attention to these issues, but, having the Commission's work in AI, let's expand that, right? So we need to expand the work to include information and communications technologies, or ICTs, in the supply chain, quantum computing, as Tarun mentioned, data privacy and security, and what lies on the horizon. I'm on the Secure and Competitive Markets Initiative with R Street Institute, and we're working to address supply chain ICT strategy. But on the flip side, quantum computing, policies, those are still, very nascent. That we're obviously waiting for different standards to come from NIST, and waiting to develop policy on that. But we need a strategy and policy, those frameworks that address not only threats from critical technologies today, but also in the future. And again, as both mentioned, these strategies have to include industry and government to harness those capabilities and to protect our nation. So as you can see, there's so much work to be done, but given the recent work by Congress and members of the Biden administration, such as Tarun, all these current and incoming experts, I'm just so excited to see what they do in this space and to see what they put out, so that we can really start to make our nation more resilient. I'm very optimistic we're going to see some really great strategies across cybersecurity, data, and technology that addresses all of these points from a whole of nation and a whole of government standpoint. So thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Well, I'd like to open things up for questions from the audience. So, please let us know what's on your mind. You can submit a question at cnas.org/live or tweet it to us using the hashtag CNAS2021. Toby, let me go back to you real quick. I wanted to ask you about the values pillar in the new strategy, and the strategy states that this includes democratic principles, human rights, tech ethics, diversity, and gender equality. So this is a very interesting contrast to the 2017 strategy. So there was some discussion of human rights and democracy online in that strategy. The word values, however, doesn't appear at all. So what has changed since 2017, and how is Australia's thinking on these issues different now?
Sure. Thank you, Martin. And firstly, can I say I appreciate a fellow policy wonk who reads into the details of strategies. That's always good fun to engage with. I would say it reflects the changing nature of the environment that certainly, I've personally seen through this position, but I think as governments we're experiencing. What have we seen is that I think, there's two ways that I can describe this. Technology is going to reflect the values of the society that it's absorbed into, right? And the other side of that is that technology is also going to have values baked into it at the production side and the innovation cycle too. And certainly we felt that that values piece has become ever more present as countries have absorbed these technologies. You can begin to see that there's a certain blueprint of use that they're intended for and the ways in which they're utilized. And we actually have a certain window to be able to shape the values of some of these technologies, because if you like, and probably I'll hear lots of people sigh quietly on the line when I say it, but if you look at something like AI algorithmic programming, I would tell you that you really only have a kind of 5-year window, maybe, I don't know, if I'm feeling optimistic, maybe a little bit longer, to really impact upon the way in which we're programming in and baking in certain aspects of AI that will then become the norm in 20, 30 years time down the line when we're looking at the more mature usage of that technology. Therefore, it's absolutely vital that at the innovation stage, the design phase, we're talking about values in technology. And I must admit, I can't agree more strongly with our other speakers about the concept that we need to be multi-stakeholder in our engagement. We need to be talking to industry, to civil society, to academia. It's only through that engagement that we'll make better policy inside government. However, what's become clear, quite evident, is that it becomes increasingly difficult to understand and pinpoint what some of the values are for some of the big multinational tech firms who are developing, some of these new advancements. And wherever they may be in the world, you can sense that there's this tension between if you like, the maturation of their technology, the development of new markets, and the kinds of values that they hold as organizations and as companies as they develop those cycles. So, we feel it's important to be influencing that at a real pivotal point in tech policy cycles. Not only other international governments and talking to them, but also to tech industry and other organizations with a hand in that. But the second part of this is making sure that values that we hold dear are actually being advocated for at a whole range of different organizations, whether it be, the traditional UN bodies, ASEAN regional forums, which I often spend a lot of time in, but also, as Tarun and Laura mentioned, the bodies such as standards organizations, such as the ISO, the ITU, and IETF, ICANN. There's a whole range of these standards and governance bodies that, whilst they might not be common in many people's vocabulary, they are increasingly important. And to be frank, we're playing a bit of catch up in some of these organizations because certain countries have taken a very distinct interest in those standards organizations and have very directly tried to change the course in the way in which these standards and organizations are shaped and some of the agendas that they hold. So from an Australian perspective, discussions about shared values and the way in which we are more openly talking about that in the tech world is important. And, you'll see that coming through in a whole range of other areas, not just the strategy itself, but also in terms of, our alliance partnerships, some of the statements that you'll see more publicly made, whether it be in the Quad or and beyond. These issues are vital. There's no getting away from it. We are in a values contested environment in the tech space. So it's our duty in government to make sure that we're doing our best to uphold the values that we want to protect for our societies.
Great, thank you, Toby. Tarun, how is the Biden administration thinking on the issue of technology and values? How is it influencing the discussions that you're having with your foreign counterparts, and how is that shaping U.S. tech strategy in a broader sense?
Thanks, Toby. Thanks, Martin. I think Toby put it all very well, and it's hard to overstate how much it is shaping all of our engagement on technology issues with our allies. It's the basis for the new and higher level engagement that we're having with the Quad right now. It certainly underpinned the initiatives on technology issues that you saw coming out of the recent summits that the president has had, and more broadly, I think just as a kind of a frame, it's the reason why the president is talking about our need to show that democracy can deliver. And I think when he talks about that, I think it's not just a matter of delivering on economic and growth and inclusive prosperity, but it's also to show that a democratic way of technology can deliver for all of us, together with our allies as well. So it's really hard to overstate kind of how much this drives what we are doing. But I would add to that that doesn't mean that we will always have exactly the same approach with every ally when we approach some of these technologies, and that's okay. And that's precisely why you had the National Security Advisor issuing one statement that welcomed the terrific strategy that Australia released, another statement welcoming proposed regulations on artificial intelligence from the European Union. That doesn't mean that on every issue we're 100% aligned, but the reason we so warmly welcome them is they are driven by shared values, and that means we'll be able to work through differences where we do have them. And there's also, I think, a recognition that with new technologies, as they are applied to new domains, we as democracies are going to be experimenting with some of these approaches, and we're not afraid of that. We're happy to experiment and adapt and to do it together.
Excellent. Thank you, Tarun. Lauren, would you like to weigh in on this point as well?
Yeah, just a quick point. I think that to Tarun's point, I think the issue of multilateralism and working with our allies is actually very important to the Biden administration. And I think we can see that in, the creation and, the work that's going into the creation of the State Department's Cybersecurity and Emerging Technologies Bureau. So I think they take it very seriously, and I'm really looking forward to see the level of engagement on that. What I hope is that, we see the ability for more experts to, and this really goes across, all areas of the government, but, to be able to enter the government more easily and leave the government easily to, bring in talent, but also let that talent go and to the outside and, gain more experience, at the junior level and at the mid-career level as well. And so I hope we see that, especially within the State Department and looking at different career tracks as well.
Great, thank you. So we actually have a related question from Tara. Tara would like to know, with efforts to ensure that emerging technologies reflect democratic values, is there an opportunity for allied countries to account for interpersonal abusability to ensure that they are less able to perpetrate tech-enabled abuse? Who would like to take a whack at that question?
Sure. I'm happy to, from an Australian perspective, just to flag I think a model which has been really successful down under, which is our e-safety commissioner model, and really it would be very much focused on, if you like, the kind of broader abuse online, kind of cyberbullying and misuse of online means for various forms of abuse. And this model, if you like, the e-safety commissioner is part of government, but just sits just outside of government. So it's a kind of quasi-government organization, and acts, has certain legislative powers to be able to bring legal powers to bear on those that are abusing elements of the online space. And I think, it's one model that has worked really quite well in Australia. And certainly, I'd advise anyone to go and have a look at the e-safety commissioner's website to see some of the work they do. Lots of advice, lots of support networks, but also some legislative powers as well to bring some, extra authority to that role from a legislative point of view. But I also think, again, where we find ourselves right now is in that tipping point in tech policy where, governments are grappling with what's the right approach. Is it going to be through harder legislative means? Is this something that we can do through voluntary measures? And I think, if you like, the abuse of technologies is certainly something that we're all concerned with, and trying to strike the right balance between, if you like, the strong levers of legislation or the more voluntary approach. And I mean, you can see that in various different policies that we as government have come up with. Now, it's not quite in the abuse of technology space, but you maybe could classify it depending on your terminology. But our Home Affairs Department have come up with Internet of Things voluntary guidance on what good security looks like in that regard. But it's a voluntary set of standards, which is good, and it's out there for industry to follow as best practice. So that's one example where we're doing it on a voluntary basis. But there are other elements of, if you like, trying to create a less permissive environment for our adversaries, where there's very much more a harder legislative approach that's being taken, and especially in relation to, our critical national infrastructure. Now, I know that probably takes it a little bit away from where the question was perhaps aimed at. But I don't think we should be apologetic at all for trying to defend our democratic values in any aspect of technology. And really important point that Tarun makes there. This isn't just a game of, clubbing up with all your allies and only talking to those that reflect exactly, very similar principles and values to yourself. There has to be engagement with those that are going to challenge those values as well. Otherwise, you're never going to make that broader progress in the global setting. And not be afraid to have that conversation as well. So I think that's a really important point that Tarun made there.
Lauren, I believe you have a point on this question as well.
Yeah, just, from an opportunity standpoint, I saw this question and, I put on my academic nerd hat. I think it's a really great opportunity for like a track 2, a 1.5 dialogue, on issues such as this. And that I think really allows, not only government, officials to maybe participate officially, but, bringing in academia, bringing in industry as well to, I think, address these issues on a, less than official basis, and, just bring in a lot of people to discuss, some areas that may not get maybe official attention, I guess you might say. So, yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. Tarun, anything you'd like to add on this particular question?
Yeah, I would just say it's certainly an issue that some of my colleagues here are working on. Certainly, I think the Domestic Policy Council, our National Economic Council as well, including, and there is some engagement certainly as well with allies on this. And there has, I think there has been, for some years in a number of areas, including on violent extremism and so on, that I think are adjacent here. But because I don't work on it directly, I know enough to be dangerous and to shut up.
Well, great. So, Toby, you mentioned supply chain vulnerabilities in your opening remarks, and we have a question from Ewan on this very point. It pertains to supply chain auditing, supply chain vulnerabilities, and how you mitigate that risk. So, Ewan would like to know, how confident are the panelists about risk awareness in the whole supply chain of major economic sectors, such as mining operations, in other words, natural resources, and not just infrastructure? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, particularly from an Australian perspective, being that it's obviously very much at the forefront of trying to address our supply chain vulnerabilities in rare earths, for example. So I'd love to hear what your perspective is on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, and it's a really pertinent question. I have some fantastic colleagues inside government throughout our various intel agencies, through our Home Affairs Department, and more broadly than that, cross government, who have been working incredibly hard on supply chain resilience and, from a domestic point of view, trying to understand what the vulnerabilities look like, how we plug the gaps. And how we help our industries and especially our key infrastructure delivery mechanisms become more aware of the risks that they have inherited. Now, for policy wonks, if you look back over the course of the last 2.5 years, you'll see ways in which we've done that through various telecommunications legislation, through tightening up of various aspects of legislation around offences for espionage, for looking at foreign investment review, and the way that national security considerations need to be taken into that. And all of that is aimed at trying to tighten up the understanding and the legislation around what supply chain risk looks like, and essentially putting the onus onto infrastructure firms to understand their supply chain far more clearly, and have, if you like, a national security requirement to plug those gaps. Now, I believe that in Australia we're getting to a really good place on that front. And again, if anyone's interested, please put in supply chain principles into Google and perhaps Australia at the end of that, and you'll see some of those key principles, which I won't go into here, bit of further reading for everyone online, on what exactly those supply chain principles look like. At the core of that is around transparency and having an understanding of the transparency around what that supply chain looks like. But one of the questions and one of the areas that we're working hard on our international engagement was that we announced, my minister announced with the launch of the strategy, that an additional around $40 million would be invested in our international outreach and our capacity building work, because certainly, sharing our experience of looking at supply chain risk and what it looks like and what risk assessment looks like when you're making new significant infrastructure investments is certainly something that it's important to share. So a lot of that money will be invested in working with our regional partners who are going through a rapid increase in key infrastructure investments, and assisting them with good risk mitigation and risk awareness assessment in their policy making as those decisions are made. And it's, you know, again, it's not coming from the perspective that everyone has to make the same decisions as Australia did, but it's sharing some of those principles of what good awareness of your supply chain risk looks like in order that countries make the best decisions for them.
Great, thank you, Toby. So Tarun, let me turn to you real quick. So the Biden administration is in the midst of a big supply chain review right now. What are some of your thoughts on the supply chain issue in general terms?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, this is something that has occupied a fair amount of presidential attention, the attention of our of cabinet level officials as well. In February, the president launched a 100-day supply chain review, so we're nearing the conclusion of that initial phase of our supply chain policy review here, looking at 4 sectors: critical minerals, pharmaceuticals, and active ingredients, semiconductors, and advanced batteries. And so that's really a first step, looking at each of those sectors, also looking at the degree to which we are able to monitor those supply chains and what we need to do to improve that capability. I think once we complete that phase, we'll be doing much more extensive work as well in a number of sectors, and in addition, we'll be doing a lot of allied engagement on this issue. And I think that's simply reflective of the fact that we will need to take really important steps to ensure that we have secure supply chains, and some of that will be here in the United States. Much of that will be work that we need to do here, but we also expect a piece of that to be relying on friends and allies as well. And those are some of the discussions that we hope to have with Toby and some of our colleagues in the Quad, and with others as well.
Great, thank you, Tarun. Lauren, do you have anything you'd like to add on the point of supply chains?
Yeah, I know that this is a really important issue. We held a panel on this, just a couple months ago. It's definitely important for, say, the National Counterintelligence Agency, here in the United States. And so, I'm really looking forward to the results of the actual review, just to see, the whole, mapping of the supply chain sector. But you're right, it's so big, right? Both digital and physical. And so, I'm very hopeful that we can sort of get our arms around that. But, as I mentioned in my remarks, I'm part of an initiative to look at least the ICT portion of supply chains, and, try to craft some policy recommendations there. But, on the mining piece too, I think there may be some disconnect there. Only because, I have a relative who, by marriage, I guess you could say, in the industry, who, they've had some issues sort of communicating, with the government to get product to them. So there has to be some sort of, better connection there, I would say. But yeah, I'm very encouraged by the review and look forward to those results.
Excellent, excellent. And we also have a question here on quantum computing. Given your position at Belfer, I think you'll probably want to address this one. So this is a question from Bill, and Bill is asking, how concerned are you that quantum computing's cryptographic cracking abilities precede better cryptography to protect data?
Yeah, that's definitely a worrisome issue. We're working to, the United States, we're working to develop those standards. We're working to develop those capabilities, because you're right. If you look at the data that's been collected, that's encrypted, right, by our adversarial nations, if they have the ability to crack those encrypted communications, then that's really concerning. And so, I think this is sort of the next race on that, to make sure that we are the ones, to get those capabilities first. But it's not just a matter of having those capabilities, but it's also a matter of how you get, the government to be able to talk to private industry and then, push out those standards and push out, a strategy for getting people to act, or companies, really, industry to, and government as well, to adopt, those new, standards and really transition to quantum computing technologies. So I think, definitely a concerning issue, and, a lot of work to be done there. But I am very hopeful that the administration, is very aware of this and is working there. We know that NIST is working on those standards. So, hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll be in a better position there.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren. So I want to turn to another question from our audience, and this pertains to the Five Eyes countries. So the Five Eyes are Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and the United States. It's an intelligence alliance. John would like to know, geostrategic competition is driving Five Eyes countries to tighten export controls, investment screening, and stem tech flows to adversaries. These same measures also prevent tech flows between the Five Eyes. How can we manage these tensions? And this is, a fundamentally important issue, right? If you want greater multilateral cooperation on a whole range of tech policy issues, these export controls among the allies and partners is, of course, a major hurdle. So maybe, Tarun, we can start with you to see how the U.S. government is thinking about this. And then, Toby, I'd love to get your thoughts from the Australian perspective.
Sure, thanks. Look, I think I spoke to this a little bit earlier. I think our objective is to ensure that we can have unified standards, common approaches to technology protection, and the closer our alliances and ties, hopefully the closer those standards and approaches, so that within that zone, we are able to share as much as possible. We are able to do as much as possible when it comes to R&D or data sharing, so on and so forth. And so I think the objective is to kind of minimize that kind of friction within the alliance, particularly within the Five Eyes, by taking a common approach so that we don't have to worry about adversaries gaining access. And to the degree that we are able to rely on shared intelligence, that only deepens our ability, I think, to kind of have some of these common approaches as well when we're building on that analytic baseline.
Great. Thank you, Tarun. How about you, Toby?
Yeah, sure. Look, there's a whole section in the international strategy around research, industry, and innovation, and addresses some of these points. If I can do a quick plug, internationalcybertech.gov.au, you'll find all of our policy inputs on this front. Needless to say, it's obviously that's a tricky question, especially when you get to the issue around dual-use technologies. Goodness, I think back donkey's years to when I used to work with lots of biological weapons analysts and chemical weapons experts who were all working on the various protocols and conventions, and the conversations around dual-use technology in that space was complex. I think it becomes just infinitely more complex when you're dealing with these high-end technologies and defining, well, what's dual use or not, and what are things being used for. And that's something, obviously, as governments, we're puzzling through at a rate of knots. I think I just violently agree with what Tarun said. Whilst, yes, obviously, countries are doing stock takes and trying to understand what it is we're trying to protect, perhaps what we're not so comfortable with moving around. Equally, this is still a fundamental opportunity, these technologies. We still need to be able to have market access and be able to move goods and services around the world. Obviously, the current context makes that a slightly different equation, but something that we know moving through the COVID situation we're in, these technologies we're talking about are going to be fundamental to our economic recovery. So it's in our advantage to work through this quickly and efficiently and creatively to make sure that we are not collectively hamstringing ourselves whilst not also giving away so much IP to would-be adversaries that we disadvantage ourselves too. And I think that means that we are prepared to take risks on things. I'm really heartened by what Tarun said in terms of, this massive uptick in R&D investment in the US. One way we're doing that, a good example in the international space, is we've set up a joint R&D fund with India around critical tech, and some of the early projects are actually around quantum R&D that we're doing jointly between universities here in Australia and in India. And it's almost taking that entrepreneurial spirit into those kinds of programs of work. And, I'm really proud that our Prime Minister announced that, and, really willing that on to success. The partnership is so solid, but, looking at more programmatic work like that with partners, I think is really important to discover some of the new ways in which you can work together. And a lot of this is invariably going to be about building plenty more trust with non-traditional partners, and taking them into confidence in different ways. And again, I've seen that fundamentally shift over the last few years as well, because I think all of us know that to prosper and really make the most of the opportunity in this new tech environment, we're going to have to be a lot more adventurous in the way that we're doing our business.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Lauren, so as a former intelligence officer, you've had some firsthand experience with the Five Eyes and that special relationship that we have amongst these countries. Do you have any specific thoughts on this question in that context?
In that context, I think I'll sort of leave that be. But I did want to make a point on actually data policies. I think one area that is really ripe for discussion and work, multilateral work, is data localization policies, right? So we're talking about tightening the flow of data between countries, and especially our allies, based on concerns of the lack of data security in this country. And so I think that's one area that we can really work on within our own borders. But we really need to be able to loosen the flow of data between our allies, especially to develop those critical technologies like artificial intelligence, because they necessarily require access to diverse and large data sets, right? So those are some areas that I think are very ripe for discussion, especially within the Five Eyes context.
All right. Well, we are almost at the top of the hour, so I think what I'll do is let's close with some parting thoughts from each of our panelists. So Tarun, we'll start with you, and then Toby, and then Lauren.
Thanks very much for hosting this, Martin, and great to be with you, Toby and Lauren. It's just one reflection. I've really been heartened by the degree of enthusiasm, the energy, the ideas by so many of our allies coming forth, whether it's in the Quad or whether it's been the summits with Korea and Japan. The energy, to move forward has really been tremendous, and I'm incredibly optimistic about what we'll be able to accomplish, not just in the coming years, but just over the next several months. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Our pleasure. Toby, please go ahead.
Martin. Yeah, no problem. Thanks very much, Lauren, Tarun. Absolute pleasure to be on a panel with you, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I would say, reflecting what Tarun said, this area of policy making is just growing at such an extreme rate of knots. And something I found in that international environment is that if countries don't already have strong international outreach programs in the cyber and tech environment, they're certainly thinking about it and wanting to learn from others. So, therein lies an opportunity in of itself of shared experience. I think increasingly something I've spoke about in some forums has been this idea that in this environment of complex tech policy, we at times have to be comfortable with chaos. And that isn't a comfortable place at times when you're working inside government, but I think it's important to be that way. That's inherently the way that, that the advanced tech environment works. And I think it presents us with a distinct challenge as policymakers to be able to respond to that. But I think you're seeing that, and I can only reaffirm how much we appreciate the Australian government working with Tarun and colleagues across the US government in pursuing this agenda. Now is the right time to be doing it. We're playing a bit of catch up in some areas, but I think now we've got our foot on the gas. And I'd always also put out an open call. If people want to get in contact, share ideas, thoughts, challenge, always welcome those. So thanks very much.
Yeah, absolutely. The momentum behind these initiatives is truly remarkable. I mean, if you look back even just a few months ago, how much progress has been made, it's quite astonishing. Lauren, I'll give you the honor of the last word.
Oh, thank you. It's really been an honor to be on this panel today, and especially with Ambassador Feakin and Tarun. So thank you. I mentioned that there's so much to be done, but really in the last 100+ days, I think there's been a lot done as well. We've been hit by so many different attacks this year in cyber and technology, and I think they've provided some real opportunities for us to actually start to focus on shoring up our resilience. People want to help, people want to get involved, and so we need to make it easier to come into government and leave government when we need to. And also, I just want to press that, diversity is national security. And, I'm again, just so heartened by this administration's, and of course, Australia's mention of this too, but, their focus on this. So, I'm really excited to see what is coming. So thank you so much.
All right, that's a great note to end on. This concludes our event. I want to thank our guests, Ambassador Toby Feakin, Tarun Chahabra, Lauren Zabierek. It was a great discussion. I really hope that we can have you back at CNAS for a future event very soon. I want to thank our audience for joining us. Thank you for your great questions. And I also want to thank my CNAS colleagues who do so much work behind the scenes to make these events possible and to make them such a great success. So thank you, Shai Corman, Jasmine Butler, Anna Peterson, Aina Rikkonen, and Henry Wu. Be well, everyone, and we will see you very soon. Thank you so much.